Yes, good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you back today to the second day by introducing Professor Martin Jay, who is the Sidney Hellman Ehrman Professor of History at the University of California, Berkeley, and one of the leading experts on the Frankfurt School, an intellectual historian with a wide array of works. His first book in 1973 was The Dialectical Imagination, a history of the Frankfurt School and the Institute of Social Research. And I will not take up time from his precious contribution by listing all of his works, but I would like to draw your attention to a book that came only last year, which is Reason After Its Eclipse, on late critical theory, which is a very ambitious attempt to draw the history, you can say, of the concept of reason itself, all the way back to the Greeks and even to the pre-Socratics in the early ideas of the Logos, and to trace this concept up to the present, and with a particular emphasis on the work and legacy of the Frankfurt School. So with no further ado, I will just give the floor to you. Please welcome.
Thanks. Great. So thanks, Hans, and thanks to Arpad and Sven-Olof for inviting me to this extraordinary gathering. I've been doing Frankfurt School conferences for longer than I like to remember, and it's always wonderful to see people, see familiar faces from many decades, really, of discussions of this still, in some ways, quite remarkable body of material that continues to produce new and interesting ideas. I'm going to be talking today about the particular role of psychoanalysis in the history of critical theory. When Herbert Marcuse was asked by a skeptical questioner how Marx and Freud could be unified in one coherent theory, he defiantly replied, and I quote, "I think they can easily be married, and it may well be a happy marriage. I think these are two interpretations of two different levels of the same whole, of the same totality," end quote. Leo Löwenthal would likewise recall, quote, that the systematic interest that must have spawned this fascination with psychoanalysis for me and many of my intellectual fellow travelers was very likely the idea of marrying historical materialism with psychoanalysis, end quote. Now, this metaphor of marriage was in fact often applied to the audacious integration of Marx and Freud in the critical theory developed at the Institute, and I myself in fact used it in the Dialectical Imagination. It suggests more than just a conceptual integration, but one also charged with affect and expressing an emotional bond between two loving partners joined together harmoniously and capable of producing heirs inheriting the best traits of each. But whether it was a true and enduring marriage, let alone a happy, harmonious, and productive one, is a question that I think needs to be reopened. For it's still not clear that two such seemingly different traditions, one stressing socioeconomic relations, confident in scientific rationality, and radically political, the other, individualist in focus, dwelling on unconscious irrational desires, and cautiously therapeutic, the two such seemingly different traditions can never find the theoretical and practical equivalent of connubial bliss. Among the Marxist skeptics was Walter Benjamin, who, in one of his essays, denounced capitalism as a religion and then argued that psychoanalysis, quote, belongs to the hegemony of the priests of this cult. Its conception is capitalist through and through, end quote. Other later commentators, also invested more in Marx than Freud, have concluded with Frederick Jameson that, quote, we've all probably overstressed the Freudo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School, which is finally realized only in Marcuse. defenders of Erich Fromm, who ironically was largely responsible for the Frankfurt School's initial attempt to combine the two before his break with the Institute in 1939. Defenders of Fromm likewise came to praise him as a champion of a Marxist humanism who recognized the ahistorical and biologistic limitations of psychoanalysis. And purist exponents of Freud, for their part, have stressed Marxism's fundamental indifference to psychological questions and radical historicization of human nature, which they trace back to the founder himself, and thus the sterility of the forced marriage. In the words of Philip Rieff, Marx followed Hegel in his anti-psychological orientation. Capitalism elicits personality types. Personality types do not first elicit capitalism, end quote. Well, it's such a counterintuitive synthesis, call it marriage or not, was nonetheless envisaged well before the Frankfurt School emerged as a distinct intellectual formation. Intimations of it can be traced as far back as Leon Trotsky in Soviet Russia, before it was explicitly proscribed when Stalin came to power and Pavlovian behaviorist conditioning became the reigning orthodoxy. And one can find even more determined advocates in interwar Central Europe, such as Siegfried Bernfeld and Wilhelm Reich, and of course among the Surrealists in France. But the abiding interest in Freud shared by most theorists associated with the Frankfurt School, and here we'd have to include Habermas and Honert as well, makes critical theory, I think, an illuminating test case for the fruitful combination of the two traditions. Now, in what follows, I want to focus on four motivations that overlapped but emerged to prominence at different moments in the Frankfurt School's history, which compelled the first generation to serve as marriage brokers between Marx and Freud. The first reason for the matchmaking, apparent even before Max Horkheimer took over as the official directorship of the Institute in 1930, was the hope that psychoanalysis might help answer the exigent question, the urgent question generated by the failure of orthodox Marxist theory to generate revolutionary practice. The second was the complementary insight it might offer into the unexpected success of a political movement that traditional Marxism had not foreseen, that of course being fascism, which stubbornly survived, we might argue, after the Second World War, in what might be called the fascism with a human face of an administered society comprised of one-dimensional men. The third motivation, evident especially in Marcuse's mature thought, grew less from the dystopian anxiety driving the first two than paradoxically from a stubbornly residual utopianism. It drew on an imaginative reading of Freudian theory to envisage a civilization very different from the one whose discontents Freud himself accepted with resignation as inevitable in any conceivable alternative. And finally, the Frankfurt School, in particular Horkheimer and Adorno, looked to psychoanalysis as a resource in the philosophical struggle to defend a plausible materialism against idealism or consciousness philosophy and its denigration of somatic pleasure and indifference to the sufferings and needs of the creaturely self. Now, before, however, exploring each of these motivations and their consequences, we have to clarify one important premise of the Frankfurt School's approach concerning the relationship between psychoanalytic theory and therapeutic practice. Three of the early members of the school had in fact themselves undergone psychoanalytic treatment: Erich Fromm, Leo Lowenthal, and Max Horkheimer. Fromm, of course, went on to be an analyst himself, training with Karl Landauer, a leading figure in the German psychoanalytic movement. In 1927, Horkheimer was analyzed by Landauer, albeit only for a year and apparently with little concrete effect beyond the loss of anxiety about lecturing without notes. But because of his enthusiasm for the intellectual content of Freud's theories, Horkheimer encouraged the creation of the Frankfurt Psychoanalytic Institute in 1929, led by Landauer and Heinrich Meng. In fact, even inviting it to take up quarters in the Institute of Social Research's newly constructed building. Leo Lowenthal recalls, quote, that the mere fact that a psychoanalytical institute was allowed to use rooms on a university campus was then almost a sensation. And he also proudly recalls his own role in helping Freud get the city of Frankfurt's Goethe Prize in 1930. Communications with Sigmund Freud himself followed, in which he praised the institute for bringing his ideas into a university setting for the first time. In a letter written by Max Horkheimer in March 1932, in which he sought Freud's advice about a substitute for Erich Fromm, then temporarily sidelined with tuberculosis at the Institute's branch in Geneva, the importance of psychoanalysis to the interdisciplinary project of the Institute was emphasized. Horkheimer writes to Freud, "I am convinced that without the use of psychoanalytic knowledge, Kenntnisse, our project will not be fruitfully realized. And I believe, and I hope I'm allowed to say, that such a participation in social scientific research will not be without value for the development of psychoanalysis itself," end quote. Now, what is perhaps most revealing about this letter is Horkheimer's stress on the cognitive payoff of psychoanalysis rather than the therapeutic. An earlier enthusiasm for Gestalt research into the holistic workings of the mind, which he cultivated during his student days in Frankfurt, helped him overcome the hostility to psychology typical of most philosophers of the era, but did not lead him towards anything like the efforts made by such contemporaries as Wilhelm Reich with his sex pol clinics to alleviate the suffering of sexual alienation. Although assuring Freud that he himself had been personally analyzed by Landauer, he gave no indication that the Institute would emulate the model of Landauer's Institute, whose leaders were active analysts, but instead would rigorously separate theory from practice. In one of the aphorisms in Dawn and Decline, in Dämmerung, his pseudonymously published collection of little aphorisms and essays, Horkheimer had already expressed his distrust for the ideal of, quote, inner health, which he said people thought might be an antidote to objective suffering, and asked scornfully if the revolutionary can, quote, determine at any given moment how healthy, neurotic, at one or at odds with himself he may be. These bourgeois categories, he said, reflect their own world and not the struggle which proposes to unhinge it, end quote. Now, while here the distinction was between political activism and therapeutic practice, when the former grew less likely, radical theoretical speculation informing disciplinary social science replaced it as therapy's antonym. Significantly, the same attitude came to characterize the Frankfurt School's approach to two other traditions that had vigorously sought to unite theory and practice, broadly speaking, religion and social. Despite the frequent introduction of theological ideas into critical theory, they were never tied to the observation of religious practices. And a similar pattern can, of course, be seen in their complicated attitude towards the unity of theory and practice, the shibboleth of Marxism ever since the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. So the selective and evolving incorporation of psychoanalysis into the Frankfurt School's theoretical arsenal was likewise marked by a coolness to therapy, which became especially clear after its emigration to America, where ego psychology and what was called neo-Freudian revisionism could be condemned for enabling conformist adaptation to the status quo in the service of a dubious individual cure. And as a result, there seems to have been little, if any, ongoing reflection on what we might call psychodynamics within the Frankfurt School itself. For example, the intensity of the friendship between Horkheimer and Friedrich Pollock, or the rivalry for Horkheimer's favor between Adorno and Leo Löwenthal, or the unconscious motives in the break between Fromm and his colleagues. Nor was much effort spent in a self-examination of, say, tacit gender or heteronormative biases in much of their work and the organization of their research program. The validity of Freudian theory, like its theological and historical materialist counterparts, was not to be tested pragmatically, but should be understood as what Horkheimer called in a programmatic essay in the inaugural issue of the Zeitschrift, quote, an indispensable auxiliary science for history, end quote. Now, in that essay, which was entitled Psychology and History, Horkheimer acknowledged that historical context was more important than allegedly permanent traits of human nature, and challenged the liberal emphasis on the eternal priority of the individual over the social. But he was no less insistent that historical materialism had erred in reducing individuals to mere functions of their economic class and in minimizing the role of rational desires rather than rational interests in motivating human action. Insofar as the economic substructure of society influenced the ideological superstructure, and this never, of course, meant a simple reflection, the mediation of psychological forces operating on the individual, not collective level was absolutely crucial. He writes, and I quote, that human beings sustain economic relations which their powers and needs have made obsolete instead of replacing them with a higher and more rational form of organization, is only possible because the action of numerically significant social strata is determined not by knowledge, but by a drive structure that leads to false consciousness, end quote. Rather than assuming a simplistic model of rational self-interest of the type favored, say, by utilitarianism, radical social theory, quote, should penetrate to these deeper psychic factors by means of which the economy conditions human beings. It must become largely the psychology of the unconscious. In the same inaugural issue of the Zeitschrift, in 1932, Erich Fromm expressed the Institute's position in a manifesto titled The Method and Function of an Analytic Social Psychology. Approving the ambition of psychoanalysis to be listed among the natural sciences, Fromm also concurred with its belief in biological instincts. Indeed, he went so far as to claim, quote, that man's instinctual apparatus is one of the natural conditions that forms part of the substructure of the social process. Now, by the instincts, it should be understood, by the instincts, Fromm meant Freud's early dichotomy of sexual pleasure and self-preservation, and not eros and thanatos, the life and death instincts developed, of course, in 1920 with Beyond the Pleasure principle. The first of these, sexual pleasure, he stressed, was more malleable than the second, which meant it had to be understood in terms of the life history in which it was realized. Rejecting the idea of a mass or societal soul, psychoanalysis thus rightly focuses on individual development, but, and this was the source of its compatibility with Marxism, it understood that process in social and historical rather than purely personal terms. The key mediation, this is Fromm's, I think, most important argument, between childhood development, which Freud has seen as crucial, and the larger social world, the key mediation was the family, which is itself heavily influenced in turn by class. Against the normalization of the bourgeois patriarchal family, which had led Freud erroneously to universalize the Oedipus complex, an analytic social philosophy of the type now advocated by Fromm acknowledged the malleability of both psychological and social conditions, and thus the existence of different libidinal structures in different circumstances. It also recognized the crucial role of psychological factors in the fostering of false consciousness, or, quote, the formation of ideologies as a type of production process, as another form of the metabolism between man and nature. The distinctive aspect here is that nature is also within man, not just outside him, end quote. Now, as the Institute's sole trained analyst, who had a doctorate also in sociology, Fromm was entrusted not only with the task of theoretically integrating Marx and Freud, but also with addressing concrete empirical questions illuminated by their complementary insights. In 1929, he had designed an ambitious research questionnaire with the aid of Hilda Weiss, which sought to gauge the readiness of the working class to assume the revolutionary role assigned to it by Marxist theory. Now, although its completion was interrupted by the Institute's forced migration to the United States and publication initially thwarted for reasons that continue to be a bit in dispute, it anticipated several later projects, including the studies in family and authority in the 30s, and then the 5 post-war studies in prejudice, the most influential of which, of course, was the authoritarian personality. Positing a spectrum of what he called personality types, later he would call them social characters, ranging from the revolutionary to the authoritarian, the survey revealed a troubling discrepancy between conscious political allegiance on the part of leftist workers and underlying psychological inclinations, which were often rather troublingly authoritarian. It was in fact the dawning realization that growing authoritarianism found on both ends of the political spectrum required a psychologically informed analysis of contemporary society and politics that provided the second motivation for the integration of psychoanalysis into critical theory. Leftist theoreticians of all stripes, many writing from the exile into which they had been driven after 1933, were compelled by events to account for the unanticipated rise of fascism. Freud's analysis of the ideologies and symptoms of various individual psychopathologies seemed to some applicable to social phenomena as well. So, for example, Wilhelm Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism of 1933 was a pioneering attempt, stressing the importance, once again, of the family and the repression of adolescent sexuality, although it in fact lacked any empirical research to support its conclusions. Drawing on extensive empirical studies, the Institute studies in authority and family, a sprawling collective effort that was never fully completed, also drew on psychoanalytic categories to explain the dangers of what it called the sadomasochistic character rampant among lower middle-class supporters of fascism in particular. Fromm's later single-authored text, Escape from Freedom, 1941, grew in certain respects out of this analysis, but it also reflected his growing disenchantment with Freud and estrangement for the other Institute members, which had led, in fact, to their bitter separation in 1939. Now he attacked orthodox psychoanalysis as excessively biologistic and pansexualist, as well as overly invested in childhood development and the putative universality of the Oedipus complex. In its place, Fromm praised the more socially inclined perspectives of Karen Horney and Harry Stack Sullivan, which focused on interpersonal relations in the present. Contrary to Freud's viewpoint, he writes, the analysis offered in this book, in Escape from Freedom, is based on the assumption that the key problem of psychology is that of the specific kind of relatedness of the individual towards the world, and not that of the satisfaction or frustration of this or that instinctual need per se. Relief from the discontents of this specific society would come not through realizing the desires of the libido, let alone an instinctual drive towards self-destruction, but rather through the ability, quote, of man to unite himself with the world in the spontaneity of love and productive work, which would avoid the search, and I quote again, for security by such ties with the world as destroy his freedom and integrity of his individual self. Now, Erich Fromm's alienation from his colleagues only became widely known really in the 1950s, when he engaged in a vigorous public polemic with Herbert Marcuse, whose Eros and Civilization we will examine shortly. But the estrangement was well underway by 1938, when Adorno left Europe and joined the Institute's ranks in New York, an event that has often been seen as initiating a paradigm shift in the development of critical theory. Adorno's respect for Fromm had in fact always been tempered, although he could still approach him as late as November 1937 with an unrealized proposal to write an essay for the Zeitschrift on what he called the feminine character. He writes a letter to Fromm where he discusses at great length. Now, Fromm had himself shown a recent interest in the matriarchal theories of Johann Jakob Bachofen and Robert Briffaut, but Adorno's interest lay elsewhere. He denounced in this letter the pre-Marxist Feuerbachian celebration of wholesome sensuousness that he saw in Wilhelm Reich, and rejected the romanticization of completely uninhibited women as an antidote to patriarchal repression. Instead, Adorno was convinced that women were maimed, even more than men, by capitalism. Why? Because of their susceptibility as consumers to commodity fetishism. He writes, more and more am I convinced that the actual coincidence of Marxist theory and psychoanalysis lies not only in analogies of superstructure and base with ego and id, etc., but rather in the connection between the fetish character of the commodities and the fetishized character of human beings, end quote. In fact, several years earlier, in 1935, in a letter to Walter Benjamin, in which he outlined his views on Freud, Adorno had asserted, quote, that in opposition to Fromm, and in particular to Reich, I defend the position that the true mediation between society and psychology was to be found not in the family, but rather in the commodity and fetish character itself, that the phenomenon of fetishism is the authentic correlate of reification. So you see him moving away from that stress on the family that Fromm and Horkheimer, for that matter, had found so significant in the 1930s. Adorno had not participated in the Institute's research program on family and authority. And although the mediation of the family was to be included as one factor in the analysis of the authoritarian personality, it was not there in the section that he himself composed. Adorno stressed on the importance of fetishism instead, both in economic and psychological terms, was also evident in his analysis of the culture industry. Thus, for example, in his important essay of 38 on the fetish character of music and the regression of hearing, it played a key theoretical role alongside other psychoanalytic categories as masochism, neurosis, and regression. Now, in that essay, he could still insist that the concept of musical fetishism cannot be psychologically derived, that values are consumed and draw feelings to themselves without their specific qualities being reached by the consciousness of the consumer is a later expression of their commodity character. For all contemporary musical life is dominated by the commodity form. The last pre-capitalist residues have been eliminated, end quote. Marx, in other words, for Adorno, in this essay at least, still trumped Freud, especially now that the mediating role of the patriarchal family had been diminished with the erosion of paternal authority. But when it came to explaining the rise of the particular fascist pathology that developed in capitalist society, Adorno came to recognize the value of psychoanalysis. In a later essay in 1951, drawing on the studies in prejudice, as well as his own empirical work on fascist propagandists in the 1930s, he made clear his debt to Freud's group psychology and the analysis of the ego. He writes, "It's not an overstatement if we say that Freud, though he was hardly interested in the political phase of the problem, clearly foresaw the rise and nature of fascist mass movements in purely psychological categories," end quote. Adopting Gustave Le Bon's influential theory of the crowd, but without the Frenchman's contempt for it, Freud had understood the libidinal ties that bind the masses together into a kind of brother horde, which explains more than any primitive herd instinct. Individuals regress to members of a mass when they identify with an idealized leader, generally an oral type, using language to appear magically as both unique and everyman. The apparent contradiction between the two, between the unique and the everyman, Adorno claimed, could be explained by Freud's theory of narcissism, in which the little man both submits to authority and identifies himself with it. Hostility to an outgroup was also a mark of the excessive self-love characteristic of narcissism. And of course, you can hear anticipations of the populism that supports a Trump in our own era in these remarks. Lest, however, he be thought as advocating an essentially psychological explanation of fascism, a misunderstanding that often, in fact, dogged the authoritarian personality as well, Adorno insisted, quote, that fascism as such is not a psychological issue. Psychological dispositions do not actually cause fascism. Rather, fascism defines a psychological area which can be successfully exploited by forces which promote it for entirely non-psychological reasons of self-interest. So you see here also Marx, in a way, trumps Freud. In fact, one of the great ironies of drawing on psychoanalysis to explain mass behavior in the age of fascism is that it was originally developed at a time when the individual self was still relatively strong, still coherent enough to be the focus of therapy, whereas now such a self has been almost entirely hollowed out, leaving, quote, post-psychological, de-individualized social atoms which form the fascist collectivities. And it was for this reason that Adorno would later cite with approval Leo Lowenthal's pithy insight that mass culture is psychoanalysis in reverse. Why? Because it cynically uses the tools designed to make sense of psychic conflict, quote, in order to ensnare the consumer as completely as possible, and in order to engage him psychodynamically in the service of premeditated effects, end quote. Now, Adorno's skepticism about the survival of individuals with enough ego strength to resist the lure of fascism, even in the America in which he found refuge, was evident in the sour remarks about psychoanalysis in Minima Moralia, which also appeared in 1951. And it's interesting, this book, perhaps Adorno's most fascinating collection of aphorisms, is very, in a way, cynical about Freud. A lot of critiques of Freud in it. Ironically, whereas Fromm had distanced himself from the biologistic, ahistorical premises he saw in orthodox psychoanalysis, Adorno attacked Freud for losing nerve in his refusal to embrace their deeper emancipatory implications. Rejecting the revisionist advocacy of therapeutic empathy and warmth against Freud's alleged coldness, he argued that the real problem lay elsewhere. Freud, he writes, Freud had tracked down conscious actions materialistically to their unconscious instinctual basis, but at the same time concurred with the bourgeois contemptive instinct, which is itself a product of precisely the rationalizations that he dismantled, end quote. In other words, too starkly contrasting reason with pleasure, the ego with the id, Freud had succumbed to the very regressive ideology his theory at its deepest level had challenged. When in the phrase has become one of his most cited aphorisms, Adorno argued that in psychoanalysis, nothing is true except the exaggerations, he seems to have been pointing to Freud's later metapsychology, with its controversial dualism of eros and thanatos. In the case of the former, in the case of eros, the life instinct, his claim is explicit. He writes, he alone who could situate utopia in blind somatic pleasure, which satisfying the ultimate intention is intentionless, has a stable and valid idea of truth. He alone who can situate utopia in blind somatic pleasure. The shallow happiness, the superficial happiness psychoanalysis seeks to recover through its therapeutic cure in the present, is instead merely, quote, a further encroachment of institutionally planned behavior patterns on the ever-diminishing sphere of experience, end quote. Peddling the, quote, bottomless fraud of mere inwardness, rather than acknowledging the crippling constraints of society, it abets adaptation and accommodation rather than real change. But, and this is an interesting point, often overlooked, for Adorno, not only Eros, but also Thanatos had a utopian implication, albeit one that was far less direct. Now, although he did not spell it out at any length in Minima Moralia, an underdeveloped, we might say, hint of what he might mean was expressed in his critique of Vitalist Lebensphilosophie, with its cult of an abstraction called life. Health and sickness, life and death, Adorno argued, are inevitably intertwined. And rejecting sickness and decay simply for the sake of life, a kind of abstract pro-life position, hypostatized as a good in itself, can have inadvertently disastrous consequences. And this is the answer why. Ironically, Adorno claimed only death is an image of an undistorted life. Only death is an image of an undistorted life. Very cryptic remark. What it might mean, however, was teased out only a few years later by Herbert Marcuse in Eros and Civilization in 1955, which was the most explicit use of Freud for utopian purposes in the Frankfurt School canon. Now, Marcuse's encounter with Freud came, in fact, later than many of his colleagues, but anticipations of his interest in the costs of sexual repression and its role in the perpetuation of capitalism can, of course, be found in some of his more explicitly philosophical writings of that era. Like Adorno, he was pessimistic about the residual role of the patriarchal bourgeois family as a haven from the heartless world in which modern men and women now lived. He was no less suspicious of the possibility of individual therapeutic cures in a society that had eroded any meaningful version of individuality and can only be rescued through radical wholesale transformation. And he was as dismayed as Adorno by what he saw as the undialectical, one-dimensionally culturalist or sociologistic and inherently conformist bromides of Erich Fromm and the neo-Freudian revisionists, insisting instead on the enduring importance of biology. In fact, a few months before the publication of Eros and Civilization, a very spirited debate between Fromm and Marcuse appeared in the New York journal Dissent, in which the full extent of the break between the Institute and their former colleague was now made public for the first time. Since their parting in 1939, Fromm had increasingly identified himself with the humanist Marxism contained in the 1844 manuscripts, de-emphasizing Freud's drive theory and the Oedipus complex, and focusing on the alienation rooted in capitalism and amenable to political change. Despite his own continuing adherence to Marxism, Marcuse insisted that Fromm had actually spiritualized values that could not be realized without a radical transformation of instinctual life itself, which was a much more fundamental challenge than restoring healthy interpersonal relations through what he mocked as the power of positive thinking. Despite later attempts by his defenders to rebut Marcuse's charges, Fromm's reputation never really recovered from this attack, which helped to elevate his opponent, one of the major theoretical inspirations of the nascent New Left. Now, Marcuse's bold reinterpretation of Freud's metapsychological instinct theory, in which he challenged in a way both the resignation of civilization and its discontents and the despair of Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment, blew on the utopian embers that still were smoldering in Minima Moralia, albeit without explicitly signaling his debts to Adorno. Adorno, in fact, wrote to Horkheimer that he was quite annoyed that Marcuse failed to do that. Reading Freud against himself, he defended the desire at the heart of the Oedipus complex as more than a yearning for a specific libidinal object, let alone the interpersonal connection praised by Fromm, but rather, quote, as the eternal infantile desire for the archetype of freedom, freedom from want. Its natural object is not simply the mother qua mother, but the mother qua woman, female principle of gratification. Now you can see, obviously, this is all from a kind of male-centric point of view, but in any event, the important point is it's the mother as a subjective, as desire, a desirable object of the subject. Contesting the wisdom of repressing that desire in the name of the reality principle, spiritualized sublimation, and the triumph of the ego over the id, he argued that it could actually be satisfied in a different civilization, one based on the ending of the surplus repression. You hear here, of course, an echo of Marx's surplus value. The surplus repression that was ideologically justified by what he called the performance principle driving capitalist production. Another more utopian reality was based on technologically enabled material abundance and the end of scarcity, which might overcome the fateful designation of only certain zones of the body as erogenous, which allowed the rest to toil without pleasure in the service of productivity, the performance principle. Such an overcoming would restore, he hoped at least, the undifferentiated sensuousness of primary narcissism, what Freud had called, albeit without understanding its liberating value, polymorphous perversity. The tyranny of genital sexuality would be ended with the revival of a more diffuse eroticization of the entire body. And here the model was less Freud than Charles Fourier, who, quote, comes closer than any other utopian socialist to elucidating the dependence of freedom on non-repressive sublimation. If such a utopian reading of Eros were not enough, Marcuse then went even further in reimagining the desire behind Thanatos, which Freud and most of his followers had lamented as leading simply to destruction, both directed inwardly and outwardly at the world, and thus inimical to the affirmation of life, characterizing the opposite instinct. Instead, he drew out the implications of that cryptic remark that I've cited from Minima Moralia, that being that only death is an image of undistorted life. Freud, he argued, had not pitted death against life as a simple binary, but rather understood them as dialectically related. Quote, the objective of the death instinct is not destruction per se, but the elimination of the need for destruction. That is, the earning of the death instinct is for the jouissance of a pacified existence, following what Marcuse called the nirvana principle, a life beyond stress, a life beyond unfulfilled yearning. He writes, if the instinct's basic objective is not the termination of life, but of pain, the absence of tension, then paradoxically, in terms of the instinct, the conflict between life and death is more reduced, the closer life approximates the state of gratification. Pleasure principle and nirvana principle then converge, end quote. Now, in so arguing, we might say, Marcuse revealed his abiding debt to the Hegel, whose rationalist dialectics he had so vigorously endorsed back in Reason and Revolution, 1940-41, a dialectics which drew on the power of negative thinking in the ultimate service of a grand reconciliation, sublating reason and happiness, spirit, and soma, individual and society, culture and nature. Now, although he was to warn against the repressive modes of desublimation, they were understood simply as deviations from an emancipatory liberation of the instincts, which would involve a new reality principle beyond the one that was crippling contemporary society. There was, Marcuse claimed, a logos of gratification that could challenge the reigning logos of domination. Marcuse's willing endorsement of the metaphor of a happy marriage between Marx and Freud can be understood in the same utopian spirit, which literally, we might say, fleshed out Marx's abstract notion of human freedom after the revolution. Now, the marriage, and I want to conclude with this point, might also be understood in a far less harmonious way, as Freud could be read more in terms of Adorno's negative dialectics than the Hegelian totalizing alternative reimagined by Marcuse. We might say that if Marcuse eclipsed Fromm in the 1960s, Adorno can be said to have done the same to him in the 21st century. And one reason was his less optimistic reading of Freud. Adorno had in fact been interested in the philosophical implications of psychoanalysis as early as the 1920s, when he composed his Habilitationsschrift under the direction of Hans Cornelius on the concept of the unconscious in the transcendental theory of mind, a work which praised Freud's cognitive disenchantment of the unconscious in the ultimate service of autonomy. In his mature consideration of the philosophical implications of psychoanalysis, a very different note was struck. Negative Dialectics, published in 1966, included a metacritique of Kant's Critique of Practical Reason, in which Adorno challenged the sway of consciousness philosophy based on the primacy of Kant's moral self or ego psychology's rational actor. Instead, he argued, quote, the dawning sense of freedom feeds upon the memory of the archaic impulse not yet steered by any solid I, Without an anamnesis of the untamed impulse that precedes the ego, an impulse later banished to the zone of unfree bondage to nature, it would be impossible to derive the idea of freedom, although that idea in turn ends up reinforcing the ego, end quote. However much freedom is connected to the ability of an autonomous subject to act according to a rational will, it contains, Adorno claims, a trace of its preconscious somatic desires. Or to repeat that formula we cited from Minima Moralia, one had to situate utopia in blind somatic pleasure, not one that's rationally understood. Freud's materialist insistence on the claims of bodily pleasures meant that a purely rationalist philosophy based on consciousness alone or rigorous moralism could simply not be emancipatory. In addition to doubting the possibility of a full reconciliation of reason and desire, as well as Eros and Thanatos in a utopian future, Adorno also continued to oppose the seamless integration of the social and the psychological, which, remembered, motivated Fromm's idea of a social character. Because of the erosion of the bourgeois family, there were no longer coherent integrated subjects or unified personalities capable of being understood in holistic ways. In addition, the attempt to mediate between the psychological and social levels of the totality through such a concept, so Adorno argued, underestimated the value of maintaining the tension between them, as well as the comparable tension between the biological and the cultural, which could not be smoothed over without sacrificing one to the other. In a still antagonistic world, without any immediate hope of reconciliation, the original fantasy of the Institute's interdisciplinary program, evident in the contributions of Horkheimer and Fromm to the initial issue of the Zeitschrift, these were for Adorno no longer viable. He writes, "The separation of sociology and psychology is both correct and false. False because it encourages the specialist to relinquish the attempt to know the totality, which even the separation of the two demand. And correct insofar as it registers more intransigently the split that has actually taken place in reality than does the premature unification at the level of theory. And ironically, the methodological tension between levels of analysis demanded by a fractured world could also be understood as prefiguring a potentially emancipatory outcome. Because the drives could not be entirely mastered by the prevailing social order, because id could never really become fully ego, there was always some hope for resistance to a world that might seem fully administered, seem fully one-dimensional. Such resistance should not be understood as serving the goal of an ultimately unified totality, however, in which dialectical antitheses were harmoniously sublated, but rather a benign constellation of forces that would maintain difference without domination, maintain non-identity without hierarchy. Because of Freud's acute sensitivity to the conflicts within the psyche and between it and the socio-cultural world, psychoanalysis remained a valuable ally in the effort to promulgate a philosophy in which non-identity could be understood as more than an obstacle to be overcome through a triumphalist process of dialectical mediation. Well, it's perhaps for this reason that even those members of the Frankfurt School who were unconvinced by the intransigently optimistic assumptions of Eros and civilization continued to try to salvage the marriage of Freud and Marx, in which they had so avidly invested their hopes before their exile. Although acknowledged as an open marriage, which welcomed ideas from other thinkers and traditions, it survived rough patches of mutual wariness to become an abiding feature of their common project. One of the first tasks, in fact, performed after reconstituting the Institute after the war was a major conference, a series of seminars and a book of essays designed to reintroduce Freud to the German public on the occasion of his centenary in 1956. In addition to restoring a tradition banished by the Nazis and highlighting the contributions of contemporary analysts such as Erik Erikson and Alexander Mitscherlich, these efforts were designed, as Horkheimer made clear in his introductory remarks, to revive a defensible notion of the Enlightenment, one in which, despite everything, the ideal of the autonomous individual might still mean something. As he wrote to Leo Löwenthal shortly before the conference took place, such an event in Germany means that the backbone of enlightened cultural forces is being strengthened. I am well aware of the risks associated with the whole undertaking, but it's one of those things that just about justifies my being here." End quote. In so arguing, Max Horkheimer demonstrated how much he maintained his youthful belief that Freud's work on the unconscious was not a capitulation of rationalism, but rather an antidote to precisely that danger. And in so doing, he expressed the stubborn faith of the Frankfurt School as a whole that not only had there been a baleful dialectic of enlightenment in which emancipatory reason, reduced instrumentality, had lost its way, but that also a dialectical enlightenment, drawing on the lessons of psychoanalysis, might still somehow help us find that, if not utopia, at least redress from the horrors of the world to which we are subjected today. Thank you very much.